am today. Goal 5 of the Sacred Heart states that all members of this community have the opportunity to share their knowledge with others. And today, I'm grateful to share my story with you. I'm going to start off with some background on my family. My grandparents, on my mother's side, were born in Gujarat, India. And they came to America in search of better education and came to college here. And ended up moving to the state of Washington, where my mother was born and raised. And although she was raised by very Indian parents, she's about as American as you can get. My father, on the other hand, was born in San Francisco, and despite being a 6-foot-tall white guy, thinks he's Indian. Don't be fooled, he's not. My brother and I were born and raised here. However, we spent a portion of our life in India, as my mother got a job opportunity with her company Cisco, and we moved to Bangalore for 3.5 years. And as I was 8 at the time, I didn't have much say in the decision. However, I wasn't particularly thrilled. But I soon found myself in an international school, surrounded by a world that I can't really describe in words. And although I had many adventures, such as riding an elephant, or a camel, or finding a baby cobra in my brother's bedroom, kind of crazy, he survived, I still lived in this bubble. I lived in a gated community, I went to an international school, and I got to speak English. But I think what had the biggest impact on me was seeing the biggest difference between these two worlds. As the second I drove outside my gated community, I saw this extreme poverty that you don't see here in the US. And I remember this particular instant. I was on my drive to school with my brother, and yes, drive, and we didn't ride camels, as I remember being a common question when I came back, like, oh, did you guys like ride camels or elephants to school? No, we had cars. But we saw this girl and boy in the middle of the street, and this girl had this metal ring that she was doing tricks in that shouldn't be humanly possible. I mean, I can barely touch my toes, but she could do flips and somersaults through this. And as I was watching her, she suddenly stared back at me. And as we made eye contact, I got this sudden feeling of guilt. How come I had my life and she had hers? How come I got to go to school, but she had to work every single day of her life just so that her family could make it? And although I'd seen many children like this on the streets before, I didn't become fully aware of this issue of child labor until about the 6th grade, when a guest speaker came to my school and told us about his work. This man devoted his entire life to taking children out of slavery and putting them into rehabilitation centers where they could be educated and then reintegrate back into society. And at the time, I didn't realize that this man's speech would stick with me, or that my 3 years in India would have such a big impact on me. But it did. And when I moved back to America in the 7th grade, I had the opportunity to share my experiences with others. And through those conversations, I learned that so few people knew about the issue of child labor, and so few people knew that slavery still existed today. The truth is, there are about 30 million people in slavery today. About half of that population is in India alone. And about 9 out of that 30 million are children. Now, I remember when I thought slavery had been outlawed with the Civil War. And when I found out that it still existed in my own country, I was shocked. And when I found out that San Francisco was the #1 slave trade network in the world, I was like, mind blown. I had no idea. But the truth is, slavery may be as close as your own backyard. And I mean that literally, as just a few months ago, a Chinese sweatshop was found in the home of someone in Willow Glen, which, if you don't know, is supposed to be a nicer neighborhood in an area near San Jose. So when I say your backyard, I mean literally. And despite knowing all of this, a part of me still wanted to find out more stories and go back into the factories and into the quarries where slaves still worked. Therefore, my mother and I went back to India last summer and spent a couple weeks working with these organizations who were willing to help us, the main one being Jeevika. And Jeevika helps take slaves out of slavery and Through personal awareness and legal rights of the government, they are able to do this. With Jeevika last summer, I was able to interview over 65 current and former slaves and hear their stories. For example, Madonna, the man in the yellow shirt, was enslaved as a 10-year-old. And for 36 years, he worked 18 hours a day in the agricultural fields, where he was beaten often. He was even beaten by the police, who were allies of the wealthy family, and were supposed to be protecting him. And after he worked 18 hours, he was forced to sleep in those same fields, where over his time, he was bitten by 3 different snakes. And he worked like that until Jeevika came and saved him. Now, I learned many stories like Gopal's through my interviews, but I think the craziest part of my trip was when I went into a brick factory, and we were interviewing these 3 men who are currently enslaved. And suddenly the owners came back, and they saw what we were doing, like us crazy Americans, and started threatening to break our iPads, break away the evidence. They were calling for backup, and we were literally chased out of that factory. And I think I remember at the time being like, this is pretty cool. Like, no idea that I was in this incredibly dangerous situation. But because of that experience, I learned how dangerous it really is for millions of slaves every single day, and how hard it is for them to get out of their situations. Not only did I learn this on my trip, but I also learned about the unjust, inhumane caste system. Now, the caste system was created thousands of years ago in India. However, it is still very much alive today. And in the rural communities, it is used to oppress people. And for example, the Dalit community, who I had an opportunity to live with this summer, are extremely oppressed and put into slavery. And the majority of them make up the agricultural slaves in India. And with this Dalit community, I learned about the oppression and discrimination that these people live with every single day. For example, for sheer humiliation, the men are forbidden to wear pants, and instead are forced to wear these rag-like skirts called lungis. And because this culture is so deeply ingrained in this society in India, the Dalit community and the untouchables, which is the lowest caste, truly believe they deserve to be treated this way. And beliefs such as karma reinforce this idea, because maybe they were bad in a past life, and in this life they have to work off their punishment and do their duty, or dharma, in order to be reborn into a higher caste and have a better life later. And other things that keep them oppressed are the corrupt political systems, as the big men want to keep their rich ways of life and maintain control on the lower castes. Not only did I see this in the Dalit community, but I also saw it in the Islamic village that I visited, where I met a girl named Gayatri, who is the girl in the yellow shirt. And what made Gayatri special is that she's my exact same age. And I think my mom was mostly affected by Gayatri because she saw the 2 of us stand next to each other and knew that despite being the same age, we lived completely different lives. And it just easily could have been me who worked 7 days a week in a silk factory and was beaten often and had lost a huge part of my memory because of these head injuries. But it wasn't me, it was Gayatri. And she has been living like this since she was 7 years old, and is still working like this as Jeevika is trying to take her out now. And hearing stories like Gayatri's made me want to learn more and spread awareness. But I also wanted to dig deeper into these questions that I still don't have answers to. Like, how do these kids who live in the worst possible poverty and have absolutely nothing are happier than anyone else I've ever seen, and wear the biggest smiles I've ever seen? In our society, we tend to associate happiness with material comforts, like the new iPhone update, or the most likes on Instagram. But how can I reconcile that with what I saw in India? And at first, a part of me thought, maybe that's just because they don't know what they don't have. But then I saw these other kids, whose lives were surrounded by labor and oppression, and they wore the opposite faces. Now, I don't know the true answer to happiness, but I do know that happiness comes with freedom. And when we're free to be ourselves and be human, we're happiest. And being human doesn't mean living under a roof or having 3 meals a day. Being human means having our dignity and being able to do the simple things like spend time with our family. All I know is that when our freedoms are taken from us, we're not ourselves anymore. And through all of this, I struggled with something more internal. I had seen all the suffering and I had seen all these people who needed my help, but I felt powerless and useless as to what I could do to help them. I knew I couldn't take every single person out of slavery, but I could give them a voice. The voice that is taken from them when they are stripped of their freedom, of their dignity, and of their sense of self. They have no way to share their stories and share their pain, but I could do that for them. And I actually realized that I wanted to do this before I went and did my trip with my mom. I realized this when I moved back to America in the 7th grade, and my English teacher gave us a simple assignment. If you were to write a book about anything, what would it be? And write the first 1 to 2 pages. And almost instantly, I knew I wanted to write about child labor. And that 1 to 2 page assignment has now turned into a 500-page book that I've written since the 7th grade and have finished, but I'm still editing and hope to be publishing soon. Now, the purpose of this book was to share these stories that I've learned, but also I wanted to spread awareness, as I knew that one of the reasons that slavery still exists today is because so few people know that it exists today. I'll give you sort of a brief summary about what my book's about. I started with just one character, a 13-year-old girl named Mukti, whose name means freedom, and she was tricked into working on a quarry with her family due to a debt of about $30 US. And she's been working there for about 5 years under these horrible conditions, and the truth is she'll probably end up living there for the rest of her life. But as I was writing Mukti's story, and I got really into it, but as I was writing it, I realized there's so many different types of slavery and so many different stories I had learned that I couldn't share with just her story. So I added 2 more characters, a 15-year-old boy named Amit, who gets trapped into agriculture slavery with his younger brother, and a 11-year-old girl named Ruchita, who starts off as a street performer and lives in constant fear of prostitution. With these 3 characters, they're all fictional, I made them up, but they represent the millions of children that do live in slavery today. And as I learned all these amazing stories, I was able to integrate them into my book. And I'll actually say in a footnote, like, this is based off of a true story, or this character is actually a man named Gopal that I met on my trip to India, which was the purpose of my book, to share these true stories. At the end of my book, all their crazy stories that I won't ruin for you intertwine and forms one big ending that, again, I won't ruin for you, because I hope you read and find out for yourself. My only reason for doing it, I wanted to share my story with you guys today, but it wasn't the only reason I wanted to do this Espacio. Several passionate people inspired me and taught me that it only takes one person to make a change, especially Kiranbai and Amit Reddy. And they devoted their entire lives to making differences in others, and because of them, change is happening. And these individuals include each one of us, and that doesn't mean that you have to help end slavery. You could help save our environment or help increase medical research. But it truly does only take one person to make a change. And that's why I wanted to share my story with you today.